Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses as we continue with part 4 of A Long Civilization's Trail, an account of recent experiences in mystic places and strange lands by Ralph M. Lewis, KRC. An article taken from Rosicrucian Digest, Volume 15, Number 4, May 1937. A Long Civilization's Trail by Ralph M. Lewis, KRC. Editor's note. This is the 4th episode of a narrative by the Supreme Secretary relating the experiences he and his party had in visiting mystic shrines and places in Europe and the ancient world. The waterfront of any large port of the world is fascinating. The bustling, the clatter of carts, trucks and dories over cobblestones, the deep-throated whistles of chugging tugs, the raucous cries of longshoremen and teamsters all add to the undercurrent of excitement. Sham, hypocrisy and shallow conventions drop by the wayside. The stark realities of life are revealed. When men go to sea, they are compelled to struggle with one of the Earth's greatest untamed elements. Preparation for its conquest requires strong will and matter-of-fact conduct. Passengers may have idealistic illusions about traveling the high seas, but the men who load cargo and make the great vessels ready for departure know that with all the safety devices provided by modern science, the event is fraught with dangers. The port of Marseille in southern France, a city of nearly 1 million population, impresses the traveler with the fact that it is more than a shipping center or a great port of call, but a gateway to the east. Here the flotsam and jetsam of North Africa, and from east of the Suez, meet with the backwash of Occidental Europe. As we stood on the pier surrounded by large cases which, from their size, may have contained airplanes or automobiles, and leaned languorously against bales of cotton from French Morocco, we studied the flow of humanity past us. Through one of those unexpected events of travel, the ship we were scheduled to take was called suddenly from the service, and we were forced to delay our sailing several hours. We were the only ones waiting who looked strictly, shall we say, like passengers. Tall Algerian blacks with tattered, ill-fitting French army uniforms shuffled past. Their eyes stared vacuously ahead. What did life hold for them? Plucked from their native environment, these simple souls were enlisted in the French army. Fed poorly and paid badly, they existed, aimlessly following the orders of white masters. Trained to use modern arms and methods of warfare against European white armies if necessary, they could be a menace to France, if ever it dawned in their consciousnesses that they were being made puppets for the avarice of white men. Children of their appetites, they are content if these appetites are regularly appeased. To maintain the necessary quietude among them, liberal France does not even draw the racial line. In cafes and on streets, Algerian native officers and French white girls enjoy each other's company without apparent social detriment to either. Scores of unkempt and gaunt priests gathered in knots, talking profusely, gesticulating freely, their personal belongings in black cloth bundles at their feet or dangling from their hands at their sides. Solemn-faced plump nuns wearing frayed grey tunics methodically climbed the gangplank. Each looked, even before departure, as though sorely affected by nostalgia. These were Christian missionaries. Their dangling crucifixes and well-thumbed Bibles which they clutched were to them torches to be carried to dark Africa to, as they believed, a heathen people. Such a simple faith, carried to an irrational extreme, has been the unfortunate cause of untold deaths, bloody orgies, and gruesome massacres. The ideal of spreading Christianity is noble, but the attitude of damning the beliefs of others to further it is ignoble. To most of these missionaries, as to thousands of others of different Christian denominations, their duty was the condemnation of the beliefs of simple-minded natives and then the substitution of Christianity. To rob man of his God and his belief in the nature of divinity is to throw him on the mercy of his own resources until, if and when, he can accept a change. To term the God of the Buddhist, Confucian, Mohammedan, Brahman, or even that of the primitive African a false deity, is to them a sacrilege equal to making a like statement to a Christian. It arouses resentment that another may dare to name his God as superior and suggest abandonment of one's own. Others than Christians are lovers of sacred traditions and have Bibles and temple teachings which they cherish as the words of the Omnipotent. The order or request that they lay these aside is an effrontery which is not taken lightly. What end does Christianity serve by this? Education, sanitation, hygiene, culture can be advanced equally well by other methods and by non-sectarian movements which do not antagonize. If Christianity is to gain converts in non-Christian countries, let her do it by examples of tolerance, mercy, and understanding, not through ridicule and the undermining of sensibilities. The former traits are, after all, the true implements of Christianity. Hilarious voices, loud laughter attracted our attention. Open, smiling faces passed. There were several families, rotund fathers heavily bearded, with funny round caps and tight trousers, mothers in voluminous skirts which they held outstretched to sweep along before them dirty-faced, wide-eyed youngsters, much like mother hens gathering in their chicks, peasants bound for Syria and colonization. Syria offered them lower taxes, more land, fewer conveniences, the same labors, life the same, but the scene changed. Mingled feelings arise in the breasts of the more fortunate who watch such parades as these. Vanity struggles with compassion, but reason tells us that the gulf between was bridged only by the flimsy structure of opportunities which the past afforded us, or our progenitors. A shrill blast awakened us to the need to scurry aboard. Our baggage had been loaded some time previously. The prospect of our journey on this SS Providence of the French line was not promising. Freighter Brouwer, having had nautical experience, observed that the exterior of the ship was quite lacking in orderliness. Her steel plates were well rusted. The former white of her upper hull and superstructure was now a dirty grey and badly chipped. Her stacks were smeared with soap and her stanchions bent in several places. With an air of contempt he murmured, "A tub," which to him was a sufficient expression to convey conclusions of his appraisal of her. We stepped on deck and looked about. Everything was confusion. No stewards to direct us to our staterooms, no signs pointing out directions. Ropes, cables, blocks and tackles and piles of weather-torn canvas lay strewn about. In contrast to the clean and efficiently organized British liners, this made one think of the old Atlantic cattle boats. The lack of cleanliness was only to be equaled by the discourtesies of the crew who were sullen and accustomed to herding about passive peasants and clerics. It was the third day out. The sea rose and fell with a slight quiver like gelatin. I have never seen it so glass-like. The sky was a magnificent blue without the flaw of even one white cloud. The sun was on our starboard side and shone warmly but not uncomfortably upon us. It encouraged rumination. On this same sea, this great Mediterranean, men had ventured as early as 30 centuries BC. What crude craft they must have possessed, what indomitable courage to push out into a vast area like this, not knowing what lay beyond, or even if there was a beyond. Many fathoms below us in this blue-black, fringed with white frothy foam, were perhaps the remains of the early Greek vessels that plied between the homeland and ancient Syracuse. Perhaps, too, there were fragments of proud Roman galleys, sunk in conflict with their mighty Carthaginian foes. What a story the Mediterranean would tell if she regurgitated all she had swallowed during the centuries. This sea must have looked the same to the admirals of many armadas and to conquering Caesars. Nations and civilizations had crashed and fallen upon her bosom, but she gave no sign of the centuries she had witnessed. Ceaseless and unchanging, she was an example of how little man's puny efforts affect nature. Though land was nowhere in sight, I thought of the favored spot of the land surface of the earth toward which we were bound, the cradle of civilization, as historians refer to it, the Great Fertile Crescent, that fringe of grassland that extends from the northern tip of the Red Sea to the mouth of the Nile. North of it are mountains, and south of it a great bay of sand, as the eminent archaeologist James Breasted described it. At its southwest extremity is the great Nile River Valley, and at the eastern end of the crescent, the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley. In these two valleys began the oldest civilizations of which we have any record. How and why they began there we can only conjecture, but nature apparently arranged her forces and elements to make them conducive to the development of man. This is obvious, as we shall later see. One tires of sea journeys, especially after several days of mal de mer, or in other words, seasickness. The sea had suddenly changed one night to a plunging, swirling fury which tossed the fairly large ship about with ease. Raising it to heights, the sea would let it slide with a sickening shiver, wallowing in a deep trough the next moment to boost it up, suspended, it seemed, in mid-air, and then to let it fall again, it rolling dizzily all the while as if trying vainly to steady itself. All this was now past. The sea had quieted except for choppy waves which were whipped by a brisk breeze. We were recuperating, finding pleasure in the thought that in a little more than an hour we were to come in sight of the shores of Egypt. The very word Egypt electrified us. Fratris, Shibli, Brower and myself went below to prepare our baggage for custom inspection, expecting considerable difficulties with the customs because of the great amount of cinema equipment and films. After tedious packing and a lapse of considerable time, we returned to the deck. The ship had slowed her speed. We peered southeastward and thrilled at the sight. There was a long, sandy strip of land hardly above the surface of the sea. It was the entrance to the port of Alexandria. On this sand strip there stood a moderately tall lighthouse. It was in this vicinity that the famed island of Pharos was located. On that island, in the entrance to the mouth of the Nile, during the Hellenistic period, about 300 BC, was erected the first lighthouse of the world. A great structure, it rose to a height of some 370 feet, or about 30 stories, equaling many of our skyscrapers. The ancient mariners could see its great light far out at sea, and were guided safely in with their strange cargoes. Its oriental design later became the basis of the Mohammedan minarets commonly seen today as a part of the architectural structure of their great mosques or temples. It finally fell in 1360 AD. It was the last of the great tower structures influenced by the Babylonian tower builders. We thought of the thousands of ships through the centuries that must have approached this port as we were doing. We imagined Cretans laden with finely carved earthen vessels and vases, and beautiful necklaces and bracelets of gold and of bronze, Greek ships with statuary and marble, Egyptians returning after trading hardwoods from up the Nile, and papyrus from the Delta, and copper from the ancient mines on the peninsula of Sinai. At that time, Alexandria was not only a seat of learning, but was, as Breasted puts it, the New York or Liverpool of the ancient world, a great shipping or trading center. As the ship maneuvered into position for tying at the dock, a motley crowd gathered to welcome it, shouting, screaming, jumping up and down, waving their hands. They were anxious for their prey. The passengers, Egyptian fellows who served as porters, Nubians, Arabs, Jews from Palestine and Syrians, either wishing to act as guides or assistants, jostled each other for vantage positions. Some wore tarbushes, fezes, others low turbans of loosely wound and much soiled linen. Still others were bareheaded. Some were clothed in awning-like striped gowns and barefooted, and the majority wore what appeared to be flannel nightgowns open at the neck, which nearly trailed in the dust of the waterfront street. Native police were finding it difficult to maintain any semblance of order, though they were freely applying bamboo-like canes to heads, backs and shoulders. After much explanation, annoyance, and a liberal distribution of bakshish, native vernacular for money, we were seated in a modern, comfortable railroad coach which sped southward along the Great Nile toward Cairo. The Nile is one of the greatest rivers in the world. It begins 3 degrees south of the equator, and flowing northward attains a length of some 4,000 miles. It, the White Nile, is joined by 2 tributaries, the Blue Nile, its affluent from the east, and 140 miles below this union, the Atbara joins it. The volume of the Nile is not great, but it has influenced the destiny of man more tthan any other river in the history of the world. For centuries it carried its alluvial soil to the sea from equatorial Africa, each season periodically overflowing its channel and depositing on either side, on top of the parched Libyan and Arabian desert sands, a black, smooth film of the most fertile soil of the world. Inch by inch, year by year, it grew deeper, pushing the desert back from the river channel itself. Vegetation flourished in this black, rich soil. It grew right up to the edge of the desert itself. Here in this valley, the early Stone Age man, who in some manner crossed the Mediterranean from Central Europe ahead of the great glacial descents, found himself in an ideal environment. Egypt is not visited by any severe storms. There are no frosts or snows. Having once arrived in Egypt, he was protected from the ice, from the glacial movements by the great natural barrier of the Mediterranean, and on either side of this Nile strip were great, almost uncrossable deserts which protected him from enemies, and he was at peace with the world for a considerable time. What he was able to accomplish within each decade and century remained. Civilization was able to build on the accomplishments of those who had gone before, instead of having all torn asunder by ravishing hordes or the destruction of nature and being forced to begin again. Thus, civilization prospered, flourished, at a time when the rest of the world was either wholly barbarian or extremely primitive. As we sped southward, we found that in many respects, the customs of these simple people had not changed with the years. On either side of us was a network of small canals, irrigation canals. Irrigation began in the Nile Valley and was developed to a science at a time when men in other parts of the world were still chipping flint hatchets. We could see small, brown-skinned men standing knee-deep in the water close to the banks and working lifts. Long poles, each having a mud basket fastened on one end and on the other end a mud ball as a counterweight. And by manipulating this sweep or pole, they would lift baskets of water from the Nile up to the level of the irrigation ditches, keeping a steady flow running through the intensely cultivated lands. Further on, we could see the application of the simplest mechanical form of pumping water wheels, to which were fastened buckets which would scoop up the water and which were kept in motion by docile water buffalo, the great beast of burden of the Egyptian, walking about in a circle, blindfolded to keep from becoming dizzy from the incessant circular motion. In the days of the pharaohs, taxes began with this system of irrigation. It was an intricate system. The ditches and dikes had to be constantly protected and maintained. The pharaohs and the nobles maintained a corps of what we may call engineers and constructors, to build new irrigation dams and ditches and to maintain those in existence. They in turn exacted taxes from the peasants in return for the use of the canals and the water. These taxes amounted to a certain portion of their crops, which had to be delivered at a given time. If they were not, officers of the nobles or the pharaoh would seize the peasant and bring him to the royal or feudal court for reckoning. Frequently we passed beautiful groves of tall, swaying palm trees, native to the country. All about us was green, though not many miles away on either side was the lifeless, glaring desert. All this life, this coolness, this vegetation was dependent upon this one source, the Nile. It is not surprising that the Egyptians worshipped the Nile. They regarded it as the god of fertility and life itself. It provided them with food, with drink. Its rise and fall made it possible for them to tell the passing of time. It carried them to the sea. Their whole existence was bound up in it. The Egyptians were not always a united people, however. There were at one time many little kingdoms that spread along the Nile. Then, in a later period, these kingdoms united into two great ones, the kingdom of the Upper Nile and the kingdom of the Lower Nile. Many wars were waged for the conquest and sole control of this fertile valley. Occasionally, as we concentrated on what we were passing, we would have a fleeting glimpse of native mud villages, houses constructed much like the early California adobe ones, bricks made of the thick alluvial soil, reinforced with straw, which would become baked by the sun, hard and resisting. As Egypt is never subject to rain, they were quite durable and an insulation against the terrific heat of the summer months. Domesticated animals, poultry and children freely walked in and out and around the houses of the village. The streets were but deep ruts in the mud. Soon we were to reach Cairo. It is said that before reaching Cairo, and just as one is approaching, the great pyramids of Giza can be seen rising above the flat tablelands of the desert. However, we were not favored with seeing them. Cairo is a tremendously large city and is affected greatly by European customs, architecture, dress, methods of transportation, etc. In modern Cairo, one feels as though he were in a city such as Paris, Naples, or some other metropolis of the world. Streetcars jangle by, taxis are honking, people are well dressed in the Occidental sense, streets are well paved. One finds a tremendous modern influence in architecture. Beautifully designed apartment houses, towering several stories, are to be seen in various sections of the city. The designs show the invasion of German architectural ideas and are of a style that is just making itself known in the bigger cities of the United States. It must be quite deflating to American egotism that considers American structures and buildings the most advanced. Here were apartment buildings equal, in their exterior part at least, and superior in many ways to those in our American cities. They are mostly occupied by wealthy persons who spend 2 or 3 months of the year in Cairo, taking advantage of its salubrious climate. The only suggestion in modern Cairo of the Orient are the robes and tarbushes worn by native Egyptians and by the Arabs. Most of these robes are worn by the dragoman or the Egyptian guides who adopt native costume in Cairo to attract the attention of tourists and travelers. Their robes are highly ornamental, made of heavy silk, with beautiful linings and artistically embroidered brocades. Most of the Egyptian businessmen in Cairo have adopted the Western style of dress. A few still cling to the tarbouch because it is the symbol of Mohammedanism. It is more than just a hat, it designates one's religious belief. After locating at our hotel, we immediately proceeded to make inquiries about the city itself. The first point of attraction is naturally the native section of the city. One feels that he must not be disappointed. He must not remain in the modern section of Cairo, for it is too much like his home country, his own city. He does not want to spoil the mental picture he had of Cairo, and so he quickly seeks out the native section, which more conforms to his concept of what Cairo should be like. The native bazaars are little changed by the years. The shops, on either side of narrow streets, many of them covered by dome-like roofs, are but small cubbyhole-like rooms in the front of which are suspended on chains and ropes, or stacked on wooden shelves attached to the wall on either side of the doorway, samples of all of the merchandise which the shopkeeper has for sale. Naturally, as you walk through the streets, you are immediately recognized as a foreigner, as a European if not an American, and the hawkers begin crying their wares and their prices, rushing out to grab you by the elbow, trying to escort you into their shops, proclaiming to you that their wares are the best, if not the most reasonable. How unfortunate one is if he makes a purchase at the first price quoted. Unlike our merchants in this country, they have no fixed prices for any of their wares. Their price is whatever they can get from the buyer. Usually there are from 4 to 5 reductions before a sale is consummated. The visitor does not learn this at first, and he usually pays 6 or 7 times the value of an article. These Cairo bazaars, because of the influence of England and the modern Egyptian government, are quite clean and neat in contrast to bazaars in Asia Minor, Damascus and Baghdad, about which we will have more to say later. The visitor to the Cairo bazaars does not realize this. He thinks them quaint and untouched by modern civilization, as he naturally has not seen anything by which to make comparisons. We returned quite late to our hotel, dining on the terrace and watching Cairo move by. Tomorrow was to be a busy day, a thrilling one. Tomorrow was the eventful September 16th, 1936, the day recorded in symbolism in the Great Pyramid itself, the day that might shape the destiny of the world, and we were to visit that edifice upon that day, after arranging for the special concession. The sense of responsibility that rested upon us, the realization that the world, through the press, was considering the significance of this date prophesied in the Great Pyramid, occupied our thoughts until we lost consciousness in restful sleep. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.